anyway, Ryan, you may come up forward.
Thank you so much, Morris and Mayor Tim. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we're working okay on the sound. I'd like to, in addition to honoring the servicemen and women of World War I, Veterans Day is also intended to honor all of the servicemen and women in our country. And as a representative of a younger generation, I think it was appropriate that Mayor Tim, a veteran of the Vietnam War, got up and spoke, and we thank you and anyone else representing for your service, very, very much so. All right. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. Tomorrow in Media on State Street is the Veterans Day Parade. I believe it begins at 11 a.m. And so if you're interested in honoring the event in an official way, it's really quite a thoughtful parade and presentation afterwards. The other thing I'd like to mention is that there's a Delaware County World War I Centennial committee that was formed a few years ago, thanks to some local volunteers. And myself and others as part of that committee have been putting on events like this one for the past 2 or 3 years. And a book is in the works that is going to be published in 2019 or 2020, recording Delaware County contributions to World War I. And over the last 2 years, we've discovered quite a few important contributions. In fact, people in this room who had relatives who fought overseas or did peace work overseas. And these are stories that need to be told and recorded for the ages. And so I would suggest if you have a story or a relative or know something special, that you either contact myself or go onto the Delaware County Commission's website. I think it's worldwar1delco.org or something like that. You will find it, and I can put you in touch with the gentleman who's putting together the book. I think February 2019 is the cutoff for entries, so we don't have a lot of time. The total number of military and civilian casualties in World War I was about 40 million. Estimates range from 15 to 19 million deaths and about 23 million wounded military personnel, ranking it among the deadliest conflicts in human history. The total number of deaths includes from 9 to 11 million military personnel. The civilian death toll was about 8 million, including about 6 million due to war-related famine and disease. The Triple Entente, known as the Allies, lost about 6 million, while the Central Powers lost about 4 million. At least 2 million died from disease and 6 million went missing, presumed dead. I'd like to read a poem and start with a moment of silence following that poem. This is In Flanders Field by John McCrae, who was a British soldier who wrote this towards the end of the war. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly. Scarce heard amid the guns below, we are the dead, short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us to die, we shall not sleep though poppies grow in Flanders field. Thank you. This lecture is dedicated to the service men and women of World War I. Soldier art did not begin with World War I. It's been happening for centuries. Traditionally, soldiers were men, but women have served in the armed forces as well. And in the tremendous amounts of spare time, people make things. There's creativity. It's part of life. It's part of our human race. These are a few items that were made by soldiers during the American Civil War. A pair of candlesticks made from bayonets. This is a pennon that was carved in a prison camp in 1862. And each of these are small carved bullets, spent bullets that were born on battlefields and carved into dice for playing games in the camp, chess pieces, and simple whimsies. We're going to start on the West Coast with an artisan you may have heard of, Dirk van Erp. Dirk van Erp grew up in Holland in his family's metalsmithing business. They hammered copper and brass and other articles into teapots, vases, milk cans, anything that you could think of. When Dirk was young, he got into some trouble and was in prison. After he got out of prison, he was ashamed and his family was ashamed. So he came to America to start a new life, and he settled in the Bay Area, California, going to work for the U.S. Navy at the Mare Island Shipyard. One of the things that Dirk did in his spare time was start hammering shell casings into artworks. Now this is 1902. World War I hasn't happened yet. There are examples of Spanish-American War soldiers hammering shell casings into art, but that conflict was relatively small, and the number of shells fired was relatively small. So this was effectively a new art. Artillery that used brass shell casings did not exist in any great quantity during the Civil War. This is a new material. And thus Dirk saw the potential in the creativity of these shell casings. A lot of them were used for target practice by the Navy out in San Francisco Bay. So the way it worked is that a casing, like this one, would be worked on a kind of like an anvil, except it was made of wood and plugged with wood and then hammered with a variety of small tools. So I'm going to pass this around, and then I'm going to pass around an example of Dirk van Erp's work. to show you, to get a feel of how amazing and thin this casing could be manipulated. This is a full artillery shell on the left-hand side. The pieces we're going to look at today basically just use the casings. But originally, a shell would have this iron piece inserted into the top, and then the cap, or nose cap, had a timing fuse that detonated the shell, either upon impact or in the air, depending on what the purpose was or the range of artillery. Then, these shell casings were discarded. Here are some of Dirk's works. It's also thought that other metal workers in the naval shipyard got interested in doing this and making these things as well. Most of these shells are not signed, but we know from period photographs of Dirk Van Erp's shop that he did make some of these. There are a few signed examples, and I have a number up here that you're welcome to handle after the lecture's over. This is a punch bowl, about the size of this piece. You can see how large the shell started out. It's thick, probably a ½ inch thick, and would have been quite tall. That's one piece of hammered brass. Dirk Van Erp was unique in this regard. He was very ambitious, and as you can see from these pieces, was very much a sculptural artist. He was less interested in recording the time, date, and place where these shells were made. This is art out of war, so to speak. In 1909, he opened his first shop. So within a year of leaving the Navy, he started commercially selling copperworks. He decided he could go into business for himself, selling some of these shells, and we're pretty sure that he was selling these things in the years 1902 to 1908 when he was working for the Navy. At a certain point, Dirk realized that he didn't have to conform to an artillery shell's limitations. Why not start buying sheet copper and pounding that into even more ambitious and beautiful forms? And so that's exactly what he did. This style in the middle and to the left is called the Wardie finish. And you can see the difference in the way the metal was controlled, a little bit more organic. This is a piece we have here, and it's quite sculptural. What I realized about this piece yesterday, it's got the Wardie finish on the bottom, and in the middle it has this kind of diagonal scribed line. I believe it's mimicking these copper bands that would get heated up to hold the artillery shell in place and form a seal. And those bands, when they would explode, were collected for making trench art during World War I because they were pure copper. You would see them being made into bracelets and things like that. So every shell would have had one of those, and I think Dirk kind of liked the idea of incorporating the form into his own decorative piece. And then this just unbelievable hammered top. This is a log carrier, probably made around 1910, 1912. Here's the shop with Dirk on the right and his young apprentice here. And this is Darcy Gall on his left, who is another metal worker in the Bay Area that Dirk partnered with for a while. There were quite a few very talented female metalsmiths working in the San Francisco area at this time. Recognize these? This is Dirk Van Erp. This is an early piece, and this is a later, more refined piece. The work just got bigger and more beautiful. Again, most of these pieces were made before World War I. So the arts and crafts movement is often given the dates of about 1875 to about 1915. And of course that's when Rose Valley was forming and other colonies. These pieces were made by another metalsmith in the Bay Area named Fred Brosi. Fred also worked at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard around the same time that Dirk Van Erp worked there. So I don't think it's any coincidence that he also went into metalsmithing. These are a few Fred Brosi pieces. In 1915, really 1914, the world changed. Elbert Hubbard and Alice Hubbard were traveling on the RMS Lusitania to Europe, and Hubbard had an idea that he was going to meet with the Kaiser himself and try to negotiate a peace with America. Hubbard was an internationally known figure, in particular for writing a message to Garcia, which was a motivational lecture that he gave all over America. And Message to Garcia, at the time it was published in the early 1900s, had as much publication as the Bible did at that time. Millions and millions of copies of this book. And a number of them were purchased by international armies to give to their soldiers. Hubbard and Alice perished on the Lusitania with around 1,200 other people, drawing America closer to the war. Quite a few of these folks were American civilians. The ship was carrying ammunition made in America to Great Britain. And so the Germans had very clearly put out a press piece the day the ship sailed, saying that, warning that American ocean liners were fair game for attacks by submarines. And they didn't flinch on this one. Also in 1915 and 1916, two other major movers in the arts and crafts movement, Will Price passed away in 1916, and Gustav Stickley went bankrupt in 1915 and sold his Craftsman magazine and Craftsman Homes business holdings in 1916, effectively ending the American arts and crafts movement as far as scholarship goes. Those three figures in particular were three of the major movers shakers. And by this time, Americans were not thinking about how to decorate their homes. They were thinking about what all of these events had in store for the future of our country, and getting worried that their boys were going to be sent over. Anyone know what this is?
Early camouflage.
Camouflage.
Yeah, early fun.
There's a number of other art art forms that came about during World War I, and I want to mention camouflage as sort of a sideline to the main topic here. In order to prevent ships like the Lusitania and others from being spotted by German subs, they were painted these dazzle patterns. And many artists in Europe and America were recruited during the war effort to conceive of these patterns, and then the various navies would paint them on the ships, including Pablo Picasso and George Braque. And it was effective, believe it or not. If you've read there was a book about the Lusitania written a few years ago, and they talk about how when the periscope would come up above the water, the U-boat operator had very little time to look at his target before retracting it. And the periscopes weren't always of the best quality. So seeing these ships is not like the way we might think of seeing an ocean liner on the sea today. They were often at far distances, so the idea was to use the sun and the patterns that the waves would create to kind of offset the lines on the ship. And I think this picture really illustrates that concept pretty well. Other things were camouflaged also. Here's a great aerial view of a German biplane showing its camouflage pattern, a tank, and a German Stahlhelm, or helmet. This is an example in the back of the room I encourage you to look at. Most of the American camouflage helmets, and this is an example, were done right at the end of the war or as the soldiers were coming home. They didn't necessarily make it into the trenches, but the German helmets did. And I thank my friend Ed for bringing an example of another camouflage helmet that you should take a look at up front here. These were soldiers who painted these things. And oftentimes you'll see the divisional insignia, like the 28th Division, incorporated. I was trying to figure out this morning how many shells were fired during World War I. It's been estimated that 100 million shells, artillery shells, were fired. Half of them roughly on the Allied side, and half of them on the Axis side. So the formula for trench art is war material and boredom. And I have a quote here. It has been said from a soldier's point of view that war is 80% boredom, 15% exhaustion, and 5% pure terror. A YMCA worker named Mary Lee said it this way: war moves in jerks, jerks which consist in moments of intense excitement punctuated by hours and weeks and months on end of boredom. A book which would picture war faithfully must not fail to give that alternating sense. First, that living has become more real, more vivid, and that the whole pace of life has been made suddenly sluggish and dull. 9/10 of war is waiting. A book which eliminates the waiting eliminates 9/10 of what people who go through war live through. This fellow and this photograph became quite famous during the war. This was a member of the Australian Imperial Force, as they were known. And this fellow collected hundreds of objects from German prisoners and German war dead. And you can see he's wearing a a German soft cap, he's got helmets at his feet, all kinds of things. He was known as the Souvenir King. Ended up being fairly highly decorated, but having almost all of his decorations stripped from him because he was alcoholic and truly wild. If you read about this guy, at one point he captured 60 German prisoners in one shot in a rage of bravura. He ended up surviving the war and bringing his collection back to Australia, where it was exhibited after his death. People went hunting other things. It was fairly common to go on rat hunts in the trenches, as these Germans probably show. There are all kinds of interesting recipes that I found for cooking said fowl. Not only was it soldiers that got involved in trench art making, it was children as well. Here's a photograph from 1915 showing British youth on some sort of bond drive. And it's kind of eerie to take a look at these youth. I don't believe they were actually wounded, but they were mimicking the soldiers that were coming back from the Somme in 1915. I can find it. So, a French magazine called Le Pays de France sponsored a series of trench art contests during the war. Cash prizes were offered and the magazine published illustrations of the winning entries. French school children also made souvenirs to sell to soldiers. In 1917, a book was published, The Michelin Guide to Reims, in case you wanted to tour the battlefields before the war was over. After remaining closed for several weeks, the schools reopened. Until then, the children had been too much in the streets, looking for aluminum fuses of shells, out of which they made rings, or for scraps of stained glass from the broken windows of the Rennes Cathedral. Everyone seems to have gone souvenir crazy. Not only do we bring in all sorts of junk from the post, but we spend every minute here making briquettes, paper knives, aluminum rings, and various doodads from Bosch bullets. And Bosch is a reference to the German soldiers. That's how they were known by the English-speaking allies. I'm amazed these photographs survived. They're just incredible to see how this work was done. A lot of it happened behind the lines when they weren't in an active front. So when the soldiers would go on rest or the unit would be encamped, it would do a lot of this stuff. Hammering metal is loud and gives away your position. So it's hard to know exactly where this stuff was happening, but you can pretty clearly see, like, they're sitting at tables and benches, probably out of the range of snipers. These are French and British troops. Oftentimes, they would fill a shell with like a wooden form and hammer into it, and the form would give it the body that it needed, kind of like an anvil, same concept. Sometimes they filled it with lead that they would melt and then pour into the shell to do a similar thing, and then they would reheat the shell and pour the lead out when the piece was finished. This is a great example of the kind of tools. Not that the soldiers on the Western Front had access to all of these. They probably made quite a few of their own tools. But this is the collection of the Dirk Van Erp Museum in Alameda, California. And I just happened to be there last week, coincidentally, and got a tour and they have all of Dirk Van Erp's original metalworking tools. And this piece in the front is basically a giant tree trunk that's been scooped out, that a lot of these larger pieces like this planter or some of those beautiful lamps that you saw would be laid on kind of like an anvil. You know, we're talking about copper and brass here. So it's a much softer metal than working a steel, which did require an anvil, and you wouldn't want to dent it. More work. You can see the soldier at the back fashioning some sort of other interesting piece. It wasn't just shell casings. We'll look at a few of them in a moment. And here is an American woman decorating with a shell that has been sent home to her. This became almost a de rigueur for the doughboys. Everyone had to get one of these shells and ship it home after the war ended in late 1918. This particular one I've collected because it has November 11, 1918 actually hammered into it. This fluting technique was fairly common. They would heat the metal up with a torch and then use a variety of tools to achieve that, almost like stretching the metal out. It's a little, it might be considered morbid using these things in one's home, but that's a matter of personal opinion. British nurse Mabel Jeffrey brought back several war souvenirs, including a flower vase from a shell casing. Her niece, Mrs. Turner, undoubtedly shared the feelings of many families when relatives brought these pieces home. Quote, "Yes, that thing by the fireplace with the flowers on it is really a shell case. It's from the First World War. My Auntie Mabel brought them back from France for her parents. I thought it was an awfully morbid thing. They had enough trouble over there. But they were all pure brass, and some bright soul, as soon as the war was over, saw his chance. I suppose they were lying all over the battlefields. It has the date of 1918 and the name of Soissons, the battlefield. That's where it was found and where she got to bring it back. I could have thought of nicer things to bring back, but I guess it was all the rage. I think it's morbid, even with the sort of embroidered design on it. If it had been me, I would have put it under the hydrangeas. I often look at it and wonder how many men this shell killed." Nonetheless, this became a significant cottage industry for the soldiers as well as a lot of the war widows that were looking for some source of income when their husbands were killed. A lot of the soldiers were farmers, and so if the male counterpart of the farm was shot down, even if he was wounded, rendering him unable to continue the farm work. This was a serious byproduct of the war. Inkwells. They actually had to bend these bullets to flare them out like that. And this is where you rest your pen. This piece here is British, and they really like to take buttons off of the uniforms. They would often trade them amongst one another, and they got into trading with the enemy when they were captured as well. This is another one of those artillery shell fuses. You can see the numbers on the top for timing when the shell would go off. And this one has also been turned into an inkwell. Belgian officer's cap, made from the bottom of a shell casing, probably turned into an ashtray. Just about every soldier on the Western Front smoked. It was very common. It was one of those little things that kept you sane. This is a really special box in the collection, and it's in the back. I encourage you to take a look at the pieces in the case, over by the mantel, and up front. When you're finished, feel free to pick them up and handle them. You can't really hurt them. They've been through a war. This box I purchased at auction a few years ago, and I thought it was worth looking at some of the details of it. It's about the size of a shoebox. On the front, it has a figure like Liberty, and she's actually got the Liberty cap on. The box is French, and it was made for a French family. It's entirely made of war material. The sides show the French Legion medal here. And this is a view of the back. I was trying to get a photograph of this, showing a large artillery shell and a French poilu soldier standing in a trench below barbed wire. This is the other side, the Croix de Guerre with oak leaves, which means that the individual received that a number of times. And the sort of, what looks to me like 1920s French Art Deco stipple decoration behind there. But really, this was made in the teens. So you start to see some fashion influence of the decorative arts. The lid is chased and hammered with a presentation. And it has this intricate series of bullet handles that work an entirely handmade lock mechanism. So that one of those is a false handle. So it takes a while to figure out how to actually get this thing open. This is intended as a security measure for someone who shouldn't be putting his hands in this really special little box. I learned after I purchased it and doing the research that this was made for a Madame Fompre. And it was given by ladies of the regiment, the 127th Infantry. And believe it or not, this piece is actually signed. I thought it was interesting that it was signed at Mühle with the umlaut over the U. My guess is that's a German prisoner of war that these ladies have asked the soldier to make this work. And it's very rare to see a piece of trench art that's signed. This is a kind of an ambitious sort of piece. Amazingly, after I did the research on this, I discovered that it was made for the wife of this man, who became one of the top generals in the French army. Started out as a brigadier, and I believe that box was given around 1915, towards the beginning of the war. But by the end of the war, he was a 2-star general. And you can see his French decorations that mirror what was engraved on the box. So these are the kind of personal stories that some of these objects bear today. Other things that were hammered. It was pretty common for American servicemen to have bathing beauties, as they were known, hammered into the, this is meat tin and skillet. U.S. Army issue. He's thinking of home, clearly. There's another whimsical piece. This is a soldier from New Hampshire. It's pretty rare to have photos or other pieces associated with the trench art. Usually you just find the piece of metal, but in this case we actually have the image of this guy and his medals. His name was Connery, And what's sweet are these two little dogs that, she looks like a Parisian lady, that's my take. And a lot of this trench art was done in Paris, or purchased in Paris, by the Doughboys, with two little dogs down there. This was a soldier from central Pennsylvania who had the piece presented to his sergeant, which was kind of sweet, and the Dove of Peace. Canteens are fairly rare. It's aluminum, so it's still soft, but it took a very particular kind of chip work with a knife to achieve that texture. There's a long history of rug work, knotting, and beadwork in the Middle East, and as you may know, the Ottoman Empire was part of Germany and Austria in the efforts during the war. So a lot of Turkish prisoners of war made these snakes, and in some cases they actually either put their name or a date, and they would sell them or trade them for cigarettes. Chocolate was a very popular commodity. Of course, money was always a form of currency. There is an example of one of these snakes in the display case at the back. Really beautiful things. And you might not know if you saw one of these at an antique show what it was. This is a piece that I found in Budapest at a flea market. It's interesting because it has like a nickel-plated finish to it, and you'll see that on some of the pieces. These soldiers had a lot of mechanical ability. Many of them worked in industry before the war. Working on farms, you needed to know how to fix agricultural equipment, and this piece was dipped in some sort of tin or nickel and then chased afterwards. I'm using the word chase, but that's the term for the kind of engraving. I'm going to pass a piece around that shows some of that, as well as a few that have a hammered finish with repoussé. This was another form of collecting. Before Americans getting one of these belt buckles that said Gott mir uns, which was the German phrase that was put on the belt buckles. Who knows what that means? Yeah. So these belts were highly coveted by the doughboys, and oftentimes these buttons were either traded for, they were also known as gravediggers' belts, for obvious reasons. And this one is an example that is in the collection here. Does anyone ever remember having their baby shoes bronze? Here's a trench boot, the only one I've ever seen bronze, with the hobnails still on the bottom. You really wonder where that boot saw service. There was no markings, no identification. I assume it was done after the soldier came home, and I found it at a flea market in Berks County. Just another type of object that was brought home, a different sort of art form.
That's fun.
I wanted to mention this gentleman is General William G. Price, head of the 28th Division, Pennsylvania National Guard. He was from Chester, Pennsylvania. And we have his granddaughter in the front row. And I tell this story to mention Sally, but also to mention this cannon that I learned yesterday as Sally and I were talking about World War I, that her grandfather had this German field gun brought back and planted in a park in Chester, where it stands today. I had no idea of General Price's connection with that field gun. What I did know about it was that a friend of mine, Kurt Sellers, who's a retired Army major from Springfield, PA, he and I, 2 years ago, went over to see that field gun and check it out and took photos of it. Kurt then contacted someone from the state, and they mounted an independent campaign to have the field gun restored. So they had this gun picked up, shipped off to a blasting shop where they took all the old rust off, had it disassembled, and then had it primed and repainted and brought back to its original location in Chester, where it stands today. So that was pretty cool to make that connection, because now we know the other piece. What's the ninth then?
Finishburg. But that was at their house, and it's when they moved from their house, so they went to the finish.
Wow.
And played on it, obviously.
Sally, where is it in Chester? Where is it in Chester?
There's a little tiny park overlooking I-95, right near the ballpark, right near the athletic fields at Chester High School. It's called Finish. It's Finish. As in Finland.
Yes.
And that's when they sold their house in Chester and moved, the county went there.
It wasn't just doughboys and men that had trench art made or were making these things. There were women nurses over in World War I. This was made on Christmas, 1918, for a nurse named Levengood, who was from the Reading area. And I researched her when she went over, and you can see at the bottom it's got AEF, which is American Expeditionary Force. This was probably made from the back of a mess kit tin. It's about that size, and that's in one of the cases as well. This is a sailor's work. It wasn't just work done in the trenches, but this incredible piece that looks sort of like a dream catcher. I'm not sure what the name of this form is. Done in different red, white, blue silks, and then mounted in a shadow box from around World War I, and featuring what appears to be a nurse or a woman who was involved in the maritime field, because she's wearing like a sailor's jumper. This piece I was really excited to find because of its pictorial content, but for a few years I just thought it was a doughboy with a French maiden kind of having a romantic moment. All right? You can see the little cat here. It's really kind of sweet. And then I was going through my mother's sheet music collection from World War I. Bingo. There's the cat, there's the little chair, and it is sort of a romantic piece, but more about kind of the mother. He's bonded with this French woman who's probably put the soldiers up at her farm property, and now he has to leave and go to battle. This is Norman Rockwell, by the way. This is an early Norman Rockwell from about 1918. Here's another piece. By the end of the war, soldiers didn't want to sit around making trench art anymore, and commercial shops evolved because there were these literally millions of soldiers debarking to come back home. And so shops in Reims, as well as Paris, cropped up, and they look very much like arts and crafts shops. They have their own little mark here, and look at this incredible Art Nouveau flower. They even designed the top of this to curl it around. Another piece made in what was called the souvenir shops. Rennes had a number of these shops there because it was a place along the Western Front where doughboys kind of had to stop to see the ruins of the great cathedral. The Germans bombed the cathedral during the war, and between the destruction of the cathedral and the sinking of the Lusitania, the Allies used these things as propaganda against Germany. And here you can see this cartoon. This is corrupt culture. This is how they do it. They destroy, medieval works of art, or so it was thought. And this vase has just an incredibly detailed engraving. I mean, it's like of a quality that a top-notch etcher would be able to produce. You can see it here. And it came not only with the little cigarette holder on the left, but the top cap of it is an ashtray made from bullets. And that's the back. It's actually acid etched. So they put a design on with wax, and then they band it, and then allow acid, some kind of muriatic acid or something, to eat away at it, and then they engrave these little florets. It's just incredible craft work. And here's the souvenir shop. Delivery made anywhere in America. So this was really a big industry. And I like to think that the American arts and crafts movement didn't end in 1915, but it actually continued here during World War I, in the trenches, and then after. And I think this is a good example. You could argue that more copper and metal work was done during World War I than even before. So in a sense, it was a proliferation of an art form that had just started to gain steam in the early 1900s. This piece came up at auction recently, made to look like an artillery shell, but by the Gorham Company in Providence, Rhode Island. And that's what's marked on the bottom. So they're making facsimiles of war art and then hammering this gorgeous pine needle arts and crafts design. I mean, it got really weird. American capitalism at work. I'd also like to just bring it back home to mention that D.O. and Stevens, as many of you know, was the son of Alice and Charles Stevens. And D.O. and Stevens grew up in this home and ended up living out the rest of his life next door. And Stevens was brought up in an artistic family that was Quaker, as were many families in early Rose Valley. The American Friends Service Committee was formed right around the time America entered the World War I in order for conscientious objectors, such as the Quakers, to serve in some capacity. And Owen Stevens and a number of others, Billy Price, I believe, went over with this group. And the group was actually formed in Delaware County, in, is it Haverford or Havertown? I think as part of Haverford College. We learned recently that D.O. and Stevens actually wrote a book about his experience there, which he illustrated and with these really sweet little pen and inks, showing the work that the Quakers were doing overseas. They built buildings, they worked on farms, they did housework, helping a lot of the war widows out, and also doing peace work, going into places in Germany and Austria, and sort of helping to smooth out some of the bitter taste that the war had left behind. And in fact, Mildred Olmsted, who would later be part of the Women's League for Peace and Freedom, went over to World War I and helped form that organization just after the war. She, of course, was the second family to live in this house. So there's this continuum, both at Thunderbird Lodge and in Rose Valley, of this peaceful war work. This is a picture of Owen Stevens. Now he's wearing a U.S. Army uniform, but the troops, they were under the umbrella of the U.S. government. So they had to wear the issue uniform, even though that they were non-combatants. A number of them drove ambulances as well, like Ernest Hemingway, not a war combatant, doing peaceful medical work. And this is out by the pergola. This is a photograph that came to us very recently. We were thrilled to have it. And then, about a week ago, when Sue sent out one of her notices for this lecture, we got an email from, would it be the granddaughter of Owen Stevens?
She's the great-granddaughter of, I think.
Lauren Starr.
Yeah, Lauren Starr. She's the great-granddaughter.
Granddaughter of Owen Stevens.
Oh,
And
granddaughter.
she said,
Yeah.
I've got this shell casing that Owen Stevens hammered when he was an ambulance driver over there. Would you like to include it in the talk? So this was an incredible find. And here we have the American Friends Service Committee logo, Rose Valley trench art, and I'd love help identifying what that third symbol is. I don't know if it related to the ambulance service or just what, but that's a mystery to be solved.
Are all three on the same object?
Yes. It's hard to photograph these objects because they're often done in the round.
Right.
This is probably done from a French 75, which was the most common caliber in artillery during the war. It was a 75 millimeter shell, so the ones that you'll see on the back table are French 75s. Trench art continued after World War I. Here's a mess kit that was done during World War II. Just as much of this stuff was done during World War II. Same conditions, plenty of time, a lot of extra war material. This was done by a French soldier in an Austrian prison camp in 1939. And this is the individual's unit, but just look at that French Art Deco decoration. It's just an amazing object. And of course, from Vietnam. I've not seen many of these, but this was done with a torch and incorporated with peace symbols, which I thought was an appropriate way to end this today. Thanks for your time. Any questions before we break?
Ryan,
Yes.
the lamps that you showed, that were done by, Venner, was that isinglass?
Isinglass or mica. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Ed.
Tell us about your uniform.
The uniform, thanks for asking. This was owned by a gentleman named William H. Porter, who was a captain in the 316th Infantry. It was gifted to me by the widow of a dear friend when I worked at Freeman's, Jim Buckley. And he used to wear it to Halloween parties. Jim and I were of the same frame. And he knew how much I cared about World War I. And so when he passed, his widow gave this to me. Now, interestingly, there was a William H. Porter who lived in Rose Valley. And I cannot substantiate whether it was the same individual or not, but we're trying to figure that out. So this is his Sam Brown bell. The uniform was custom made for him in Paris. It's got the insignia, and I've got his handkerchiefs, his cap, his spectacles, and you can take a look at those up front. Yes?
I'm Wendy Chmelsky, the curator of the Peace Collection at Swarthmore College. This month, there is an exhibit on World War I in the McCabe Library called The War to End All War, Devastation, Resistance, and Relief. So you'll see some things there that are nowhere else. Some peace materials, some more of the Quaker Relief Services, and some other conscientious objector material. Also, in the rack by the door, there are cards about a online resource that the Peace Collection's put out of over 700 original documents that have now been digitized from World War I conscientious objectors. So if you want to ask me more about it, the exhibit's there, open every day. The public is invited up till 8 o'clock at night, and it's there till December 2nd.
Great. Thank you so much, Wendy. And we learned also that the Peace Collection has letters from Billy Price and some of the Rose Valley folks that were sent back home. So that's a subject I think we'd like to talk more about here at Thunderbird Lodge in the future. Yes?
So are most of these pieces part of your collection?
Yes. Yeah. This is about 25 years of collecting. I'm interested in pieces that have unique artistic merit and pieces that have special human stories. There's a lot of trench art out there. It would be overwhelming to collect all of it. So I've tried to focus and filter out. And so I thought it would be good to highlight some of those today so you could get a closer look at them. Yes?
Paul Fussell, in his book from 40 years ago about World War I and modern memory, talks about how I guess it must have been the military leaders found that you had to regularly cycle troops in and out of the front lines. And they found that frontline troops could last about 10 days. And then you had to cycle them back to the middle fields, middle line, and then back to the far line. So it was almost like there was a monthly cycle, which has opened up for me an explanation about where and when some of this work could have happened.
Very good point. That's absolutely right. So we're going to have a little reception here. We ask